All right. Uh, Welcome, everybody, here and online. I am thrilled to introduce Mara Ostfeld. She's the faculty director of communications at Poverty Solutions and an assistant research scientist at the Gerald Ford School. She is a political scientist trained at the University of Pennsylvania with a master's degree in public policy from Harvard and a BA in social work. Woo! She has been a wonderful addition to the Poverty Solutions team, bringing many innovative ideas, tons of fun, and a little bit of chaos. And I'm really fascinated by the work, the subject of her book, which she's talking about today, and the implications of it in thinking about interactions on a daily basis, as well as our national milieu. And she just came back to us from a stint at NBC and Telemundo doing election analysis. So you can ask her a little bit about that in the Q&A too, if you want. So without further ado, Mara Ostfeld.
Thank you, everyone, for being here and for joining me today. I just want to acknowledge Trevor and Carissa for all their work organizing the series. I always really enjoy it every year. I always learn a lot about so many different topics. So thank you guys for Carissa's in the back by the door. So thank you guys for all the work you've done to put this together. And again, thank you guys for being here. I also want to acknowledge this is part of a book project it's a book that was published earlier this year that was co-authored with my colleague, Nicole Yaden. It was supported by the Russell Sage Foundation, and we had a team of pretty incredible research assistants, Camry Hudgens, who's now a doctoral candidate in the political science department, Tanya Lopez, Lydia Lopez, Isabel McMullen, and Crystal Robertson, who's at UCLA. So just want to acknowledge and thank them. I want to start off the substance of this talk by just reflecting on the 1964 signing of the Civil Rights Act. And this act, as many of you may know, provided protections for voting rights. It protected access to a variety of public spaces and public facilities. And it also established equal employment opportunity as the law of the land. And it provided these protections based on race and national origin and sex and religion, and notably color. It provided protections based on color apart from these other dimensions of one's lived experiences. And that's something really important. We've seen all of these protected classes. We've seen action taken on all of them in a variety of contexts, including in charges brought up against the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Looking at skin color alone, just in the last 20 years, charges brought up based on skin color discrimination have more than tripled. What's really noteworthy is that most of these charges actually have not gone anywhere. And a key reason is because the judges involved were not sure how to even think about skin color. What is that? Who says what your skin color is, and who says it's different from somebody else's? And at what point does that merit enough of a difference for it to be the course of action? So there was this recognition that thousands of people are experiencing skin color discrimination every year in a way that affects their access to opportunities and their lived experiences. And at the same time, judges weren't really sure what to do about it. How should we even think about dealing with this? One case was brought forth in Puerto Rico, and the defendant was said to have done a good job at establishing at face value that skin color discrimination could be real, but, quote, the statistical information in relation to color discrimination is flawed. Another case had the same point. The court recognizes that discrimination based on skin color may occur among members of the same race, but the plaintiff is unable to offer any authority for the novel proposition that such discrimination may form the basis of a cause of action. Judge saying, you didn't have good enough evidence. I couldn't take what you said on face value. You need to provide more evidence that this action, that your lack of promotion, that your lack of hiring was based on differences in skin color or discrimination based on skin color. But the judge proceeds to say, the court refuses to create a cause of action that would place it in the unsavory business of measuring skin color and determining whether the skin pigmentation of the parties is sufficiently different to form the basis of a lawsuit. The count must therefore be dismissed. So it highlights this tension, right? Again, there's thousands of people who are whose access to like life chances, that their access to accruing wealth and building wealth and raises and employment opportunities are affected by skin color discrimination, but nobody really wants to measure it, and for good reason. In our country, we have a very kind of problematic history with measuring racialized attributes. So how should we think about how to get into thinking how to measure, operationalize, or take into account skin color? So again, 3 points made in these cases. Should we measure skin color? How would we measure skin color? And does it really matter? And I want to focus on these latter two. How does one measure skin color? What are the possible ways we might think about doing this? And if we do that, what is the evidence that it really matters for socioeconomic opportunities and in terms of how we position ourselves in politics? If it affects socioeconomic opportunities, then we might affect it's how it also affects how we're sorting ourselves into political coalitions. And if it matters for these two things, this kind of serves as the basis of determining the pros and cons of actually whether we should measure skin color. Is it too problematic? Are these measures too invasive? And is it really revealing anything that would help us rectify this pervasive problem in American society? So I just want to start off by pointing out one way that skin color has often been measured. This is a scale that my colleague and I put together, and it's based on another common scale where it just provides you a scale. It says, here's 10 different forms of skin color, different colors. Where would you position yourself? And this has been used in a variety of cases where I might look at Trevor and say, okay, he's here on the scale, or where Trevor might use it himself and say, okay, I position myself here on the scale, self-assessed or interviewer-assessed skin color. And using this measure, there's been a variety of data that's been developed, right? So we know that within Black individuals, within Latinx individuals, within even white individuals, skin color matters. Using that measure, skin color, those with darker skin are less likely to be given opportunities to accrue wealth. They're likely to be paid less. They're less likely to have jobs with occupational prestige. They're more likely to live in more segregated neighborhoods. They're likely to have fewer years of education, worse health outcomes, more interactions and more negative interactions when they do interact with the criminal justice system. And at the same time, they're also more likely to be perceived as having racial authenticity and legitimacy. So we have this overwhelming amount of evidence that skin color really matters in our society today, but again, problems with doing anything about it. Part of that is because a lot of people look at this and they're like, well, what are people talking about? If you go back to the scale and I say, well, I'm here on this scale, does that mean that's where I am? What if you say something different? What if you say, oh, no, you're a 2 or a 3, and I say I'm a 4 or a 5? Which one is true? And what's going into each of these? And the fact is that we know with a lot of our identities that when it has some type of social value, we bias our estimates, right? In the majority of situations, when a man goes to the doctor and they ask how tall he is, he's going to slightly overestimate how tall he is. In the majority of situations, when a woman is asked how much she weighs, even when she's right next to a scale that a doctor is about to use, she's going to slightly underestimate how much she weighs. And for good reason. We know these things matter, right? These things are associated with, again, everything from how you'll do on dating sites to how likely you'll get a call back in an interview, to also even how the quality of your interactions from customer service agents in a store. It matters. So there's reasons that people would bias it. And in the same way, it matters for skin color. And so we might expect people to shift how they identify their skin color to assert their proximity to valued social groups. We also might expect there's been some arguments saying, well, people learn stereotypes. And so there's been some evidence that people actually shift the way they identify their attributes in a way that reflects how they think others might view them in a context. So one piece of evidence for this is that interviewers will often shift how they identify someone. So if a Latino has a more racially authentic name, quote unquote, then they're more likely to be seen as having darker skin. And if they're seen as having higher levels of knowledge, then they're going to be rated as lighter skin. And this has been shown systematically so that the use of this scale is useful, but it also has some problems. We might even look at how people use emojis as a piece of this. Some people have looked at someone else sending an emoji and been like, I'm not really sure if that's how other people see you, or that looks a little bit too light or a little bit too dark. And we see people talk about this. There was one person in a recent news article who said, I present as very pale, very light-skinned, and if I use the white emoji, I feel like I'm betraying the part of myself that's Filipino. But if I use a darker color emoji, which maybe more closely matches what I see when I look at my whole family, it's not what the whole world sees, and people tend to judge that. And what this individual is highlighting is that they're debating how they want to position themselves. Here's the group I value. I value my proximity to my family, or I value my proximity to this group. And I want to estimate my skin color in a way that emphasizes that that's an important part of who I am, an important coalition in my world. And so it just reinforces the idea that the way we estimate our skin color may be a very loaded kind of measure. So some people have suggested and have used what they call machine-rated skin color. There's a 40-year-old study of heart health that's used this skin color this measure of skin color to demonstrate that people who have darker skin using this machine are more likely to have higher blood pressure, arguably due to higher rates of experiencing discrimination and the stress that that causes. And what this does is it flashes a light, and it measures how much light is reflected off of any surface, whether it's the paint on your wall or whether it's the color of your skin. It shows how much light is reflected off that surface, because darker colors absorb more light, they reflect less light, and lighter colors reflect more light. And so we use this in a variety of contexts. Again, if you want to pick, paint, if you want to choose foundation, which is how it was being used here, if you want to find a foundation that matches your skin color, or if you want to determine if this cheese in the lower left-hand corner, you can see the National Cheese Institute has a color measure. But it's been used in a variety of contexts. And so some have argued that this is what we should be using when trying to consider whether there are differences in skin color that are affecting lived experiences. And there's an artist that's recently used this to, again, just kind of drive home the point that skin color is different from ethno-racial identity. And she has this art exhibit in the upper left-hand corner showing 4 people who are classified as being of different ethno-racial groups, but all have the same skin color according to one of these light reflectance meters. And so what we did is, in trying to explore what skin color means today, how useful are these different measures, are they capturing the socioeconomic disparities to the full degree that they're affecting lived experiences, we did a survey of about 1,500 people throughout the Chicago and Detroit metropolitan regions in 2017. We had about 500 people who identified as African American, about 500 who identified as Latino, and about 500 who identified as white. We offered them a $5 cash incentive. We asked them to take a survey in which we asked them about a range of their views on political issues, on their experiences in the world, and then we asked them how they thought about their skin color. At the end, we used this machine-rated skin color, which we asked for their consent for. We asked about their self-reported skin color, and then we looked at the difference. And what the difference really is able to capture is, if we think that self-reported skin color is capturing some aspect of what my skin looks like to you, but it also captures my associations with skin color, what I view as valuable. Like that one person using the emojis, he wanted to heighten proximity to the darker skin color of his family. So it captures the values and the views of skin color in addition to, the physical components of light reflectance. Whereas the machine-rated skin color can only capture the physiological components of color. So if you look at the difference, we can better understand what are the associations that we have with skin color in America today. What does it mean? And we really wanted to test a couple of theories. Baseline, we just wanted to know which of these measures and to what degree are they associated with socioeconomic outcomes. But the other theory we wanted to test is just this idea of protecting power, this idea that perhaps in a place where we have a growing number of people who are not classified as white, and there's growing evidence that a lot of people who are classified as white feel this sense of threat to their privileged status in American society and politics, that many of these people may be motivated to protect their power. Members of racialized groups afforded more rights and protections in the context of the US, we might think of these as white Americans, will be motivated to differentiate themselves from ethno-racial outgroups in an effort to preserve their privileged status. So we might think that perhaps that means they'll overestimate their lightness, or perhaps it means they'll hold views that to support the status of whites and do not support the status or the rights for ethno-racial outgroups. So thinking about policies like police protections or immigration rights, things like that. And we expected that this bias or this misestimate might be more likely among those closest to the ethno-racial boundaries, closest to the boundaries where their access to the privileges and protections of whiteness might feel most threatened. So in this case of whites, it might be whites with comparatively darker skin. The second theory we put forth is this theory of power seeking, that perhaps members of racialized groups afforded fewer rights and protections in American history, in this case non-white Americans, might be motivated to assert their proximity to racialized groups with power. So they might, if they see liberal groups as a way of kind of positioning themselves closer to power, of reclaiming power in the US, then perhaps they'll overestimate their darkness because that's the prototype associated with liberal politics in America. Or if they overestimate their lightness, if they think holding conservative views will be a key path to kind of asserting power and claiming power in American politics. And we expected these patterns of kind of misestimating your skin color in a way that correlates with their views of the most effective path, political path for asserting power in American politics, that it would be most likely among groups who have blurrier boundaries. And what we mean by blurrier boundaries is that there are some groups, most notably Black Americans, whose position in American politics has been long defined by this one drop rule, that if you have any Black blood, that you're classified as Black. And perhaps that's debatable how much that exists today. There's a growing number. Since 2000, everyone can identify as multiracial. And so there's more permeability today than there once was. But then there's other groups in American politics, Latinos, Arab Americans, whose position in American racial politics is a lot blurrier. They can identify as Latino in one category and then as white or Black in another category. Middle Eastern, North African Americans are also classified as white, but not really treated as white, but they can also classify themselves as others. So they have this more ambiguous position in American racial politics. And we think about these groups as groups with blurrier boundaries in terms of their position in ethno-racial politics. So the first thing we wanted to look at, and taking all this together, is first, just going back, does self-assessed skin color capture the same thing as machine-rated skin color? So if we look at where everybody estimated their skin color and everybody's machine-rated skin color with this kind of foundation matching device, how much did they correlate? And the first thing we noticed is that if everyone had estimated perfectly their machine-rated skin color as their self-estimated skin color, then everyone's views would be right on that line. But what we find is about 50% of people significantly overestimated how light they were. That's the people above this line. They estimated their skin color as being lighter than their machine-rated skin color. And the people below this line, significantly below this line, about 15% of our sample overestimated how dark they are. So this suggests that there's something happening, that people, if you ask people what their skin color is, there's a lot of people who are slightly overestimating or underestimating how dark or light they are. And so something that we next wanted to know is what's determining this? Who feels most called to do this? So we next wanted to test these pieces of evidence we saw at the beginning of this talk, that machine-rated, or that skin color is associated with socioeconomic experiences. So we looked at both machine-rated skin color and self-assessed skin color and looked at how they mapped onto income and education. The first thing, looking at income, we could see, and I just try to highlight it with this black line because this is a little bit of a wonky graph, but what it's showing you is that in our sample, only Black Americans had this relationship where skin color assessed by that machine device, by that machine rating, was associated with income. And you could see that race matters too. At any point on the skin color spectrum, with darker being the lower numbers on the x-axis and lighter being the higher numbers of the x-axis, at any point on this x-axis, those classified or identified as white had higher income than those identified as Black. So race matters. But at the same time, you can see that skin color matters for African Americans a lot too. Going from the darkest end to the lightest end was associated with about a $30,000 a year difference in annual income. So there's this really big impact of skin color on one's lived experience and access to opportunities. We also looked at education, and here we didn't see anything among African Americans, but we did see these pretty big effects among Latinos and white Americans, that both Latinos and white Americans with darker skin had significantly lower levels of educational attainment than those with lighter skin, suggesting that it's their lived experience and their access to opportunities is significantly affecting their access to educational opportunities and outcomes. And so for Latinos, it's associated about, those on the darker end had about a high school level of educational attainment, and those on the higher end had somewhere between 2-year and 4-year degree. So summing this up, we found no evidence of any relationship with self-assessed skin color. I didn't show that to you, but there was no evidence of any relationship between self-assessed skin color, how people identified their own skin color, and SES outcomes. But there were these relationships between machine-rated skin color and education for Latino and white respondents, and income for Black respondents. So if machine-rated skin color matters for socioeconomic outcomes, does it also matter for how people position themselves in American racial politics? Because we know often there's this theory in politics that those who have more access to resources are then going to be more likely to hold conservative views and kind of preserve their access to resources. So we might expect that to happen. Alternatively, we might expect people to be asserting their skin color in a way that perhaps asserts their desired proximity to racialized groups. So it's this question, is machine or self-assessed skin color associated with racialized political views? We first looked at this relationship between machine-rated skin color and support for Trump. And when we look at that machine-rated skin color, we only find there was a relationship for white individuals, which I know is counterintuitive to a lot of people because we don't often think about white people having differences in skin color. But as we saw throughout this presentation, everyone has no two people have the exact same skin color. And in fact, those with darker skin, those closer to, or arguably closer to the boundaries of whiteness or closer to not being in the boundaries of whiteness, are the ones most likely to support Trump. If we look at the relationship between machine-rated skin color and belief that everyone should speak English, again, something that, again, perhaps disadvantages members of the ethno-racial outgroups or non-white Americans in the US, we see, again, there's this relationship between machine-rated skin color for whites and a belief that everyone should speak English, with the whites with darker skin being more likely to believe that everyone should speak English. We also looked at whether it was associated with trust in the police to use the right amount of force, and we didn't find a relationship. But we did find these 2 points where we find this relationship, again, between whites' machine-rated skin color and support for more conservative policies on racialized issues. This is counterintuitive to a lot of people, so we also wanted to just test, is it really true? Are white Americans with darker skin more likely to assert racialized views on political issues? And if it's true, is this really driven by an attachment to the white racial identity group? So we look at the relationship between skin color among whites and white, an esteem, a sense of esteem, they call it in the social psych literature, or the belief in this group is really valuable or an important part of my identity. And we find that that's true, that whites with darker skin color are much more likely to say that they hold the white racial group in high regard, that they believe it's an important part of their identity, and they believe it's a more valued social group in society. So it kind of is consistent with what we were showing before, that those whites with darker skin perhaps are trying to preserve their position and the privileges associated with whiteness. So this is consistent with that idea of protecting power. We next wanted to look at this self-assessed skin color on political issues. And this looks at how people are estimating their skin color and how that maps on to political views. And again, we first looked at support for Trump, and we don't find anything here among whites. We don't find anything here among Black respondents, but we do find that among Latinos, those with lighter skin are more likely to say they support Trump. There was no association with belief that everyone should speak English among any of the ethno-racial groups. But when we look at, again, the trust in police to use the right amount of force, we again find that Latinos with lighter skin are more likely to say they believe that police use the right amount of force. So again, this is something that tends to be associated with more conservative positions, more conservative coalitions, and their views on how to deal with racialized political issues. I think a lot of people at the beginning of this talk, I had mentioned, critique the idea of self-assessed skin color and what it is and isn't capturing. So we wanted to use both of these measures so that we can look at the discrepancy, the difference between how people assess their own skin color and how a machine might assess their skin color, and look at whether that difference that kind of captures the associations we have with skin color, if that's really what's driving this relationship we see here, if that's really what's driving people. Is it really politics that's causing people to overestimate how light they are among Latinos, or overestimate how dark they are if they support liberal views? So we look at this relationship with skin color discrepancy. And again, those who overestimated how light they were significantly more likely to support Trump, but only among Latinos. We find no relationship, again, with speaking the belief in the importance of speaking English. And then again, looking at the relationship with the belief, the trust in police to use the right amount of force, we find Latinos who significantly overestimated how light they were more likely to say they trust police to use the right amount of force, whereas Latinos who overestimated how dark they were more likely to say they did not trust police to use the right amount of force. So if we look at all of these together, we see support between the first points among white Americans in this idea of protecting power, that skin color is kind of being drawn upon and used, that those with darker skin are more likely to say they want to protect their access to power by asserting more conservative views on racialized issues that tend to disadvantage the outgroup. Among Latinos, we see support for this idea of seeking power, that Latinos are drawing, in many cases, drawing on skin color to kind of assert their proximity to political coalitions that they believe would enhance their proximity to power in American racial politics. And we see this with self-assessed skin color and that measure of skin color discrepancy. And so if we take a step back even further, I think what some of this really highlights and what I try to drive home is, yes, that skin color matters, that we show that machine assessed measures of skin color are associated with a variety of socioeconomic outcomes and opportunities in terms of income and education. We also see that the measurement matters, that machine-rated skin color was capturing kind of lived experiences, whereas the self-assessed skin color was kind of capturing how people wanted to position themselves in response to the ways that skin color is politicized in America. We see that it's playing an important role in how Americans negotiate shifts in racialized power structures. Thus, again, going to how it was whites who are on the closest of the darker skinned whites who are most likely to be on the boundaries of whiteness, on the boundaries of experiencing the privileges of whiteness, that were most likely to assert conservative views. So we see this response to these growing number of non-white Americans and kind of concerns about shifts in power. And we also, again, saw that it was only Latinos who had that relationship between self-assessed skin color and political views, which is consistent with that point I put out at the beginning, that those in groups with blurrier boundaries are perhaps the most likely to draw on skin color to assert their proximity to racialized power coalitions. So with that in mind, we might expect the significance of skin color to grow as there's more multiracial Americans who kind of have this blurrier position in American racial politics, that as the number of Latinos grow, as the number of Middle Eastern North African Americans grow, that the significance of skin color will likely also increase. So those are my big takeaways. I know it's a lot to throw at you, but I'm really interested in your reactions and thoughts. So thank you, guys.
What questions do we have for Dr. Ostfeld?
So given all this information, how would one use that to help improve on poverty?
I mean,
reduce poverty, not to improve it.
No, I appreciate that point. It kind of drives home, like, what's the takeaway? I mean, I think the takeaway is that we can't just dismiss the significance of skin color. I think it really drives home for all these people who questioned whether skin color really mattered. Is it a measurement error? Skin color matters. I think it moves us to the next stage of thinking about, okay, I don't necessarily think we should have these machine ratings of skin color in all our contexts. I think that's another ethical situation that we have to grapple with, but it shows that something has to be done about this and that we need to center this more, and we're increasingly going to have to center this more in how we address racialized disparities. But I look to a lot of our students to think through this more in the coming years.
I guess to start off with just one quick question, I guess the respondents for this this survey analysis that you guys ran, you said this was in Chicago, correct?
It was so we went throughout the Chicago region and Detroit, and we really made an effort to make sure we went to like more liberal areas and more conservative areas. We went to agricultural fairs and the Puerto Rican parade. We went to like places that had gun shows, and we went to places that were flea markets. We really wanted to make sure that we captured diversity in terms of like rural, urban, income, and politics.
Yeah, that was my thought process. I was interested to hear or see what this would look like if you were to take this study across the United States, or even, worldwide, to consider what folks in South and Central America, how they view these topics as well. I thought would be extremely interesting. But apart from that, I'll say I thought that this talk was extremely timely, and I think it's a study that a lot of people don't typically look very closely at. I think it's in the side views of people that run around within the political spheres, and it's extremely timely right now because, of course, the election season that just passed and what happened in Florida with them becoming increasingly more and more Republican as we realize. But being from Miami personally, I see this firsthand, so this is my lived experience. To recognize that Cuban Americans typically do vote on the Trump side of of or conservative politics because of their proximity to whiteness. But it hasn't really been a topic around the political discussion, I think. So a lot of folks, when we do have these elections runs that come through, people will ask the question in the end of the cycle, why do Cuban Americans choose to vote on this side of the aisle? And to me, it's extremely obvious, but to other folks who haven't seen these types of studies, I think it's a little bit more, a lingering question, but this type of work clears it up. So I appreciate it.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And it's interesting. I think what we saw in Florida too was that Cubans were pretty consistent. Like 67% supported DeSantis this year, about 68% supported him in 2018. The shift was among Puerto Ricans and other Latinos. And I think it's interesting because especially for the other Latinos, where there's like a growing number of folks coming from Venezuela and Ecuador and Mexico, I think when people first come to the US from any country, like the Democrat, Republican, it doesn't mean anything at first. So you have to learn the meaning. And there's this really great sociologist from Illinois who had done this work showing that Latinos, whether they choose, because you know how Latinos identify Latino, and then there's a separate question to identify as white, black, other, whatever. And so there's this really great evidence that they determine whether they are identified as white or black or other, not based on how they look, but based on how they negotiate American racial politics, how they think of it, and how they're learning what these parties mean and which ones basically their most likely chance of being closer to economic success in America. So those who are surrounded by people who support conservative views are going to be like, okay, this is what I need to do to kind of position myself better for the future. And so it was really interesting how, like, as people come to the US and they see these racialized politics at the same time that they're learning what these parties mean, they start to conflate. But I think that also gets in another dimension of what you're getting at, and we'll see what happens.
So this is funny because I had a very similar question. I think you already addressed some of the points that I said. But I do want to say, I think the work that you're doing is excellent. I think it's very tangible and material and has real implications for the moment that we're living in right now. And I was just going to ask if you did see in the data or have other data that get at the nuances within the Latino community around national origin and also immigrant generation status. And so if once, like let's say, you get a group from Mexico, Puerto Rico, wherever it may be, if they're here 1 generation, 2 generation, 3 generations, how does that shift over time? If you're seeing any data that might speak a little bit to that. And then you mentioned the pieces about how folks see the political parties in the United States is very different. Puerto Rico, of course, is a great example. So much of the alignment with the political parties in Puerto Rico and the alignment here is based on status. And so I thought that was a great point. I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on that. But like I said, it overlaps already with the previous questions.
No, I mean, I think I've thought about this. I think all of us probably thought about this a lot, but I think it's interesting because there's some work that's been shown too that, like, when people come from the Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico, where they often move to, especially in the past, they often moved to New York, they often moved to majority Black areas. And so you saw people like that group of Latinos were more likely to identify as Black after living in those areas because of like what power looked like around them. So it doesn't have to always go in one direction. It's a very localized dynamic where power can look different in different spaces. And it's how, like, what do we teach people power looks like in different spaces? I think it's a really important thing that we have to think about more. And it goes into like what's in books and who's on city council and who's controlling your schools. I think all of those affect what power looks like. Go ahead.
In order for people online to hear you.
Oh, you're online too. Okay. Dr. Ostfeld, super interesting. I'm mostly curious, how did you get 1,500 people to fill out the survey for only $5? And particularly given the broad cross sections of people that you were surveying, having been to gun shows and agricultural things, and also having been to lots of protests and things, they're just really different crowds. And so I'd love to hear more about who you recruited to do the sampling, and were they using iPad? Just a little bit more about your methodology.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. That's something we thought a lot about. And so we did get a diverse sample of students, that we had like skin colored variation and then ethnic variation, so that we could try in a lot of situations to match who was doing the outreach to who we were trying to reach. in conservative areas, we spent a lot longer in those areas trying to get responses. Our plan was to go in, and we did. We asked every third person that walked by us if they would take the survey. $5 cash made a difference. We didn't have gift cards. It wasn't a check, but we had $5 cash that we could hold. I think in a lot of places around here, the Michigan brand, a lot of people would be like, oh, my cousin got, a kidney transplant or something like that. And so, yeah, that helped. Or I like football, like things that obviously we have nothing to do with, but it helped us. So a lot of people had this, I don't know, a positive association with the Michigan brand that helped. But I do think $5 cash has been shown to be a positive thing. But I take your point that a lot of areas it is increasingly hard. And so especially the conservative areas, we had to spend a lot longer days.
Hi. I just wondered if in the conversations you had with people, any of them talked about the time of the year or what they do. And I asked for a few reasons. I grew up in Iowa.
Mhm.
So out there, like with farmers,
Mhm.
like the cap, it's like
Mhm.
snow white here, and they are so, so dark after
Mhm.
being out all summer. And I've had my colleagues in India,
Yeah.
they get tan lines under their watch just like I do. And my African American soulmate is a dark man,
Mhm.
but he can get darker in the summer too. So I
Mhm.
just wondered if anybody talked about that and how they rated themselves.
I think, yeah, that's a really important question. And it's interesting because the people who do these measures a lot, that heart health study, they actually take the measure in your armpit to make sure that it's not areas exposed. We did not do that because I felt really uncomfortable going into people's armpits. But what we did was we especially in the summer, we took a measure on the bottom side of their wrist and then on the top side so that and then we averaged them so we could do measures with both areas exposed to the sun, not exposed to the sun, and then the average of the two. We also were wondering whether like skin color changed that much over the summer, and we didn't find, maybe it's because we're in Michigan, we didn't find a big change in skin color among most of our respondents because we started in June and we ended in August, but we didn't find a big change. We also we didn't have information on occupation, but we had information on college. And given that a lot of times people think of working class whites as non-college folks, we looked at whether among those who didn't go to college, if there was any, if the findings still hold among them, assuming that perhaps more of those individuals might be working outside. And we found the same findings held. So I think you raised really important questions, and I'm glad you thought about that. And that's something that we think should be accounted for in all this stuff, and we try to think about too.
We have a question online from Monique Taylor. When do you expect the world to stop using the tone of our skin to determine what our worth is?
It's interesting because a lot of people in Latin America, they like to say that they're like, there's this Latin Americanization of democracy, that because there's so many shades of brown, that skin color won't matter. But I think it just takes different forms over time. I think it's very deeply ingrained in us to try to protect our own access to power and to keep it away from some outgroup. And so maybe it'll take different forms. Maybe now it's more based on race. Maybe then it will be based on skin color. And maybe at another point, there's going to be some other dimension. But I think as long as we're human, we have this very innate component of trying to form tribes and discriminate against outgroups. And so I think we just always have to be mindful of that and try to find ways to inhibit the degree to which it affects access to opportunities.
Thank you for your talk. I'm taking a class on Latin American politics, and yesterday, like, our entire lecture was pretty much about like this topic and how it relates to like electoral participation and economic circumstances of different groups of people in Latin America. I was just wondering if there was any like just research you were doing like in comparison to this.
In Latin America?
Yeah, just sort of like if there's any research.
Man, I feel like Latin America is so much farther ahead of us in thinking about this. It's crazy how much work's been done throughout Latin America. It's been shown that even like if two people who are classified as different racial groups have a kid and the kid's wealthier, then they're more likely to classify them as a lighter skin color category than if two people have kids who's like lower income. Basically, they do this really complicated study to show that people are changing the way they classify the very like color-centric measure of racial identity in Latin America. They're shifting that in a way that reflects their wealth. And so they're basically saying the idea is that money whitens in a lot of parts of Latin America. It's not only money, but people are actually shifting in a lot of ways. And we see this in America too, that people are shifting the way they identify various attributes in a way that reflects the associations we have with those, especially racialized attributes. In America now, we're increasingly seeing people who become more liberal in panel surveys are more likely to identify as multiracial over time. People are shifting their identities to match their politics. And that's been taking place in Latin America for so much longer.
Mara, you might have already sort of talked a little bit about this, but I wanted to try to bring your talk around to some of the work you were just doing this past week. And if you, like, what sort of major takeaways you have from analyzing the elections. I mean, obviously we saw things happening in New York and Florida, but do you have any analysis from that that's sort of particularly relevant as it relates to this research?
I mean, we don't in our exit poll data, we don't look at skin color, which is something I would love us to do, but the short survey, so we don't look at that. But I think going back to the gentleman's point, I didn't get your name. What's your name again? Aaron? He had raised this point about, like, we know that skin color has been associated. I think a lot of people who've been in that world, maybe we don't have all the concrete evidence, but there's been a strong, like, lived experience of knowing that skin color is associated with political views. But I think what I've also seen, and I think this data highlights, is this not just like how I might see their skin color, but people are actually shifting how they identify their skin color in a way. Like, you see people who are pretty light skin identifying as dark skin in a way that maps onto their desire to be an ally or support progressive views. And then people who are pretty dark skin saying they're, like, estimating themselves as pretty light skin and then supporting Trump. And so there's this, like, you see it being internalized as a political identity. And so that's not something I could point to with the exit poll data, but when you see people talking and you do these interviews, it seems like something that's becoming more prominent.
Do you have any thoughts about the salience of these different categories in comparison to each other? So, like, are the socioeconomic categories more correlated than the political categories? Or I always think of myself when we're talking about these things, and it's true that over the last few years, I have become more progressive politically. And yeah, I don't know if that's changed how I've perceived where I fit in racially, but I think that I think I've also thought a lot more about racism in the last 5 years. So, like, I hear that and I'm like, oh, you know, this could actually map on to where I'm at. Yeah. So
I mean, I don't think we've, like, pitted them against each other in any of our analyses, but we will say that all of those analyses of the relationship between skin color and political views accounted for income and education and all those other factors that we assume to be associated as well, including the context that people were lived in, if their zip code was majority Black or majority white. And so we find the association with politics is pretty robust. We didn't do that level of robustness checks for other things, so.
Thanks. Other questions? Oh.
I'm going to apologize because this is asking you to do something you often ask me to do, which is do a cut that the data doesn't necessarily support because of the ends. But did you find robustness? I mean, this is building off of the question about national origin. Like, I'm wondering to what extent the dynamics are driven by, like, because I'm Jewish, I follow Israeli politics, and, like, Russian Jews have a totally different, like, political bloc within the Israeli political system, and like that seems to be the causal dynamic more than race, and I'm just, like, wondering if these patterns, which are fascinating and really, really grateful for you doing all this work, hold up if you hold somehow national origin constant.
Yeah, I think our hope is to do that. We sampled with having a good number of Latino, a good number of Puerto Ricans, and a good number of Mexicans in mind, because we were in Chicago and Detroit. So that was something that we wanted to do, but we haven't done that. So that's something that, like, you often tell me that I'm going to do next. We'll see. We'll see.
I'm going to ask you to do a little bit more speculation. You were sort of saying that there is this like innate human tendency to form tribes and discriminate against the outgroup. But also, as I was reading your book, it seemed like there's a lot of historical research that really indicates this sort of colorism, towards lighter skin. And I wondered if you have a sense, like that's different, right, from tribes and outgroups. So do you have any sense like where that comes from? Is it sort of the vestiges of colonialism or?
Absolutely. I mean, so much just goes back to colonialism. But I do think I think it's the same thing. Like people were trying to protect their status, and this was one way to differentiate themselves from the growing number of people who had darker skin that were. So we saw like some of the biggest philosophers of our time, like going back to the Middle Ages, have went and really drove home the importance of skin color. Interpretations of the Bible, the Curse of Ham, that really, if you read the Bible, you're like, this doesn't have any connection with what I'm reading, but people interpret it in a way that went to reify their own perception of what would support their political end goals of preserving resources for their mostly lighter skin color colleagues. And we even see like the boundaries have always shifted. The boundaries of whiteness have always shifted. The boundaries of who's really lighter skin or darker skin and where we want to draw those lines has always shifted based on political convenience and based on the interests and needs of me or my group or whoever I am at the time. And so I do think there is something about skin color that's, kind of on this path dependent process. And so it's probably going to be harder to change than other like sources of discrimination. But I don't think it's not possible either.
Other questions? The squirrels in my backyard seem to also do this. Did you look at any other kinds of comparisons here?
Yo, do you want to know what though? Like,
Yeah.
But I'm serious. People do discriminate against, like, I think I was talking to Julie about this. People do discriminate against like darker dogs. Like it's harder for Black dogs to get adopted than it is for lighter dogs.
The same is true for cats.
Yeah, it's really tragic how pervasive and illogical we've internalized this association. But I think I go back to the point that when I was with Jessica raised before, it doesn't have to be this way. We can change representations of power. We can change what value looks like. And I think the more we do that, the more we stop reading Kant, stop reading some of these old philosophers, and we could really have a different understanding of what power and democracy look like.
Carissa is signaling that I should look at the thing again here. Oh, well, I can see it. Is there, so Kathleen Hurley asks online, is there a plan to further expand the study?
I think I'm ready to move on to studying different topics after this. I do want to do subgroups, but I do think there's a huge need, especially in getting at the ethical components. And in a context where we're thinking about like ending affirmative action, what does it mean? Just because we don't want some source of disparity to exist, do we stop measuring it? And how often that just makes the disparity worse at the expense of the people who are most likely to be discriminated against. I mean, it's just this tension between measuring things that we're really uncomfortable with and we want to go away, and then not doing anything about it and just kind of magnifying the impact that it's having on the lives who are people who are already at the margins. So I don't know if that.
So when you're out and about and dealing with different economic things, all of us, when you meet people, when you get to know them, then these differences go away in your head. I mean, you accept people for who they are, what their skin color. So an interesting thing to learn over time is what recommendations might there be that we as a society and city, et cetera, could do to formally try to break down those barriers.
I think what you're getting at is something that has been looked at a lot, and I find fascinating. So the more overlap, like right now, the problem is we're polarized on so many dimensions, and those are often reinforcing dimensions. But the more identities that we have, and the more that they overlap, and so often, I don't know much about Indian politics, but I know that there's a lot of different political coalitions and a lot of other different identity groups that aren't quite as polarized as we are in the US, and that served a lot of democratic ends. So that if I know, Trevor's got this weird accent, Trevor has a lot of differences in these ways, but we have this one commonality, then there's more opportunities for us to overlap. And so if we expand the numbers of ways we categorize and see each other, then there's more opportunities for us to identify points of connection. And so that's been one thing that even in online encounters where it's so easy to just polarize and discriminate and say really crazy things, if people are identified in their tags with more like identities, maybe not just a picture, but maybe other things, other interests or something, then perhaps we won't be so quick to polarize and classify others and discriminate.
Well, I've got about 20 other questions about squirrels and also a pushback on my accent, but we don't want to hear any of that. Let's thank Dr. Ostfeld for the wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good week. We'll see you next week for Norma Alicia.